It happened in Iowa, a Tuesday evening, late fall, the kind of night where the air smells like frost and faint wood smoke. The room was full. Not packed, not rowdy, but full, of veterans, widows, farmers, teachers, and a man standing under a flag-draped stage. Donald Trump. He'd just finished talking about oil prices, Afghanistan, and inflation. People were nodding, clapping, half listening like folks do when they've heard it all before. Then, a small hand rose, near the back. It was a girl, maybe 9 years old. Red scarf, worn boots. She stood up before anyone could stop her, and she asked one question, loud, clear, like a shot through glass. Do you believe in God? And did you ever lose someone in war? The room went dead silent. You could hear the hum of the exit sign. One man in the front laughed nervously, but nobody joined him. Trump didn't move. Didn't look at the staffer beside him. Didn't chuckle. Didn't dodge. He just looked at her. Her name, it turned out, was Reagan. Her father had died in Afghanistan 2 years ago, and tonight she wanted an answer. I remember how Trump blinked once slowly. Then he said, and I remember the exact words, I lost my brother. Not in war, but in something worse. A war no one saw, and that was it. No applause, no music cue. Just that. I don't know about you, but when I heard that I leaned in, because it didn't sound like a line. It sounded like pain. He stepped down from the stage, walked to the edge of the crowd, and crouched beside Reagan. I never wore the uniform, but I watched the bravest man I knew fight a battle in silence and lose. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't try to make it about himself. He just told the truth. And for a moment, the man known for bravado, for shouting, for spectacle, was completely still. A soldier in the back of the room saluted. No one told him to. A woman wiped her eyes. She didn't know why. Reagan looked at Trump, then held out something in her hand. It was her dad's old service tag. She whispered, he believed in God. Trump nodded. So do I. Not with a sermon, not with a Bible quote. Just those 3 words. So do I. And honestly, that's when I knew this wasn't just another speech. Because here's the thing about real faith, it doesn't need a spotlight. It doesn't need to convince. It just is. And that night, in a town hall in Des Moines, a little girl broke the script and a former president answered not like a candidate, but like a brother who still remembered the silence after a funeral. There was a long pause after he said it. Not just in the room, but in him. You could tell. Because he stood there for a second longer than he meant to. Looking at her. Looking through the noise. And maybe for the first time that night, he didn't know what came next. That's the thing no one tells you about faith. It's not loud. It's not confident. It's a whisper you keep chasing through the noise of a crowd that's already decided what you believe. He straightened his jacket, gave a half nod toward the moderator, the kind you give when you're not ready to move on, but you know you have to. The staffers shifted. They had no prep for this. There were no cue cards for when a little girl asks you about death and God. But Trump didn't flinch. He didn't pivot. He just walked back toward the podium, turned slightly, and kept his eyes on her for a few seconds more. Then he said, your father gave everything. And because of him, we get to stand here tonight. It was quiet. Not because people weren't listening, but because they were. You could hear someone sniffle in the 3rd row. A man held his wife's hand a little tighter. And all the while, Trump's voice never rose. It softened. And that more than any campaign slogan was what people remembered. I watched the press line. Journalists' frozen pen halfway off paper, unsure whether this was a quote or a moment they should leave alone. One whispered to another, if he turns this into politics, it's over. But he didn't. He stepped away from the podium and said, you asked if I believe in God. And I'll tell you something most people don't expect me to say. I didn't always. A few heads lifted. I didn't understand how a good God could let someone like my brother suffer. Fred wasn't a politician. He wasn't rich. He just believed. Even when I mocked him for it. He paused again, especially when I mocked him. There it was. The thing nobody expected, vulnerability. Not scripted, not packaged, just said. And suddenly this wasn't about headlines anymore. It was about regret, about loss, about what's left unsaid between brothers when one of them runs out of time. There was something in his face, not anger, not pride. Maybe shame, maybe just memory. The room didn't clap, because no one should clap for that. That kind of truth, it's sacred. You let it sit, you let it sting. Reagan still hadn't sat down. Her hands were shaking slightly, but her eyes didn't move. And Trump. He kept speaking, but slower now. My brother Fred used to pray before bed even when I thought it was useless. He told me once it's not about asking for things, Dawn. It's about not forgetting who's still listening. He looked at her. Sometimes I still forget. But tonight, you helped me remember. She didn't respond. She just nodded. And that nod was the start of something that none of us could put into words that night. Because it wasn't about being right. It was about being real. Afterward, the staff wanted to move on. There was a lineup of topics, a strategy, an agenda. But Trump lingered. Longer than the cameras expected. Like a man trying to hold on to a moment before it disappears back into the noise. And Reagan. She finally sat down. But not before she whispered to her mom he believed him. Not I believed him. He did. And I think that's what stuck with me most. Because maybe the truth wasn't just in the words he said, but in the space they left behind. The story of Fred wasn't new. But that night it felt different. Because Trump didn't tell it like a stump speech. He told it like a confession. I was 18 when I realized my brother was different, he said. He didn't care about deals or image or who shook his hand. He cared about peace. Fred was older, calmer, quieter. He wasn't interested in the business empire their father built. He flew planes. He read the Bible without ever quoting it in public. And every Christmas, even when the family got together for photo ops or real estate talk, Fred would excuse himself early. To pray, alone, by the window, in silence. Trump remembered one particular Christmas Eve. I was in college. I'd come home full of ego-ambition attitude. I was half drunk arguing with my dad about licensing, and Fred, he was upstairs kneeling on the carpet of the spare bedroom. He paused. There was no light in that room, just the snow glowing through the blinds. And the sound of a man asking for strength. Not wealth, not fame, strength. I remember standing outside that door. Trump continued watching my own brother pray like the world depended on it. He didn't interrupt. Didn't open the door, didn't say a word. He just stood there with a $1,000 coat on and a heart that didn't know what to do. That was the last time I saw him pray. Fred died not long after. Alcohol, loneliness, quiet battles no one ever saw. And Trump, he buried more than a brother that day. He buried questions he never got to ask. For years he avoided the topic. Told reporters Fred was a warning about addiction, a symbol. But that night in Iowa, he stripped all that away. He wasn't a warning. He was a man. A better man than I knew how to be at the time. No one in the room moved. One woman clutched her rosary tighter. A man near the aisle crossed himself. But there were no gasps, no dramatics. Just quiet. Trump looked down, then lifted his eyes to Reagan again. I didn't believe in God when Fred died, he said, because I didn't understand why someone who prayed so much got answered with silence. That line hung in the air like smoke. He didn't try to explain it away, didn't turn it into a lesson. He just let it breathe. I was angry, he admitted. At God, at myself, at the world. But Fred, even near the end, still prayed, still believed. And then softer. Maybe he wasn't waiting for a response. Maybe he just didn't want to be alone. And in that, Trump found something he hadn't expected. Not clarity, but connection. A connection to every person who's ever sat in a hospital room. Every mother who's ever asked why, every soldier who's ever prayed before a mission. He looked around the room. This country doesn't need more answers, he said. It needs more people who keep the faith, even when no one claps for it. He stepped back from the mic. His hands were still, his shoulders a little lower. And Reagan? She stood again, but this time she didn't ask anything. She just looked at him and whispered, "My dad said the same thing." When the moderator leaned forward to speak again, Trump raised a hand, not to silence anyone, but to hold the moment a second longer. "She asked me something," he said, "and I didn't answer all of it." People shifted in their seats, because they thought he had, but he hadn't. The question wasn't just about God, it was about loss, about war. Your dad was a soldier, Trump said to Reagan. I wasn't. He paused. But I've seen war. Not with bullets, but with suits. Not on the battlefield, but in hospital rooms and late-night phone calls and the kind of grief you don't talk about because it doesn't fit the headline. He stepped off the platform again, closer to her, closer to all of us. I remember the night I got the call, he said. Fred had collapsed. He was alone, in a small apartment in Queens. The ambulance got there too late. His voice didn't break, but his eyes changed, like he was seeing it all over again. No one calls that a casualty, but it is. The audience didn't move, didn't blink. This country forgets there are different kinds of war, he continued. Some we fight overseas, others we fight in silence. He turned slightly now, addressing the room. Addiction, depression, hopelessness. Those are the battles no one takes pictures of. He looked back at Reagan. And your father? He fought the kind people do see. He gave his life where people wear uniforms, where there's honor and medals and folded flags. Then Trump touched his chest gently, where a service ribbon might be. But my brother, he died where no one was looking. No camera, no applause. Just a quiet room and a man who prayed anyway. There it was. Not a policy point, not a soundbite. Just the raw, naked truth of grief. And then, as if the moment needed one more weight, he said, Sometimes I wonder, if I had believed back then, really believed, maybe he wouldn't have been alone. You could hear someone gasp, a single breath, sharp, probably apparent, because they knew that kind of regret. Not the public kind, the real kind. He straightened his shoulders. I talk a lot, he said. I say too much sometimes, but not about this. And then he turned fully to Reagan and asked, What do you believe? She blinked. My dad told me God doesn't stop bad things. He just helps us hold them. Trump nodded. That's a strong answer. He didn't correct her. Didn't teach. Didn't preach. Just received it. And for once the room stopped trying to decide whether they agreed with him, because for the first time in a long time, he wasn't trying to convince them. He was just trying to be honest. And that honesty, simple, quiet, unexpected, did something none of us saw coming. It brought everyone a little closer. Not to politics, to each other. He stood quietly for a second, as if something had landed not on the stage, but in his chest. Then he looked out across the rows of faces, not just Reagan's, not just the veterans, all of them. I want to tell you something, he said. Something I haven't said behind a podium. You could feel the crowd tense, not in fear, but in anticipation. I've met Gold Star families. I've stood by graves at Arlington. And every time I've wanted to say something that would make it better. He shook his head slightly. But the truth is, I can't. No pretense, no sidestepping. Because when you've lost someone, really lost someone, you don't want speeches. His voice slowed as if each word had weight. You want someone who knows what silence feels like. People weren't looking at him now. They were looking down, or closing their eyes, or holding hands, not because they were sad, but because they knew. Then he continued. My brother's war didn't have an enemy uniform. It didn't have a treaty. It had shame and pain and bottles that lied to him in the dark. He took a breath, and I failed him, because I thought strength meant not talking about pain. The room didn't move. There are men in this room, he said, who fought in Fallujah, in Kandahar, in Helmand, but some of the hardest battles are fought in kitchens, in bedrooms, in VA hospitals. He turned toward the corner of the room, where an elderly man in uniform was dabbing his eyes. That man over there, Trump said, might have come back from war, but I bet part of him never left. The man nodded. And maybe faith isn't about fixing any of that, Trump continued. Maybe it's just what we hold on to when we're trying not to fall apart. That line hung in the air. One woman whose son had died by suicide exhaled so hard it shook her scarf. But she didn't cry. She smiled, because someone had finally said it. Then Trump turned back to Reagan. You asked me if I believe in God. A pause. I do. But not the way I used to. Not the way people talk about in debates or campaign ads. He walked down into the aisle closer to the crowd. I believe in the kind of God who stays in the hospital room after the machines go quiet. The kind who sits on the floor with a mom when no one calls. The kind who listens to the prayers that aren't pretty. Reagan's mother was holding her now, tighter, like something in her had just relaxed. And Trump, for all the bombast people expected, was gentle. This country is full of people who carry grief like it's normal, who never talk about it because they think no one cares. He looked around again. I care. And that wasn't a slogan. It was a man stripped of performance speaking directly into the ache we all try to outrun. Then he said something no one expected. If your father could hear you tonight, he'd be proud. Not because you asked a big question, but because you waited for the answer. Silence. Then Reagan smiled. It wasn't big, it wasn't showy, but it was real, and it said everything. No one moved. Not the cameras, not the crowd, not even the air. It was the kind of silence you only feel in churches or graveyards or hospital waiting rooms at 3 a.m. The moment didn't ask for applause. It asked for reverence. Trump stood still. Reagan had just smiled a soft, small smile, and somehow it was louder than any speech he'd given all year. The moderator tried to speak again to steer the event back on track, but Trump raised a hand. "Let her be," he said. Not with force, not with command, with respect. He turned slightly and looked out again, not scanning the crowd, searching. And then he walked down the steps, into the aisle, toward Reagan. The security team shifted instinctively, but didn't move, because something about his pace, his posture, said this is not politics. He reached her, knelt not fully, just enough to be eye level, and then with a voice only she and her mother could really hear, he said, "Your father mattered, not because he wore the uniform, but because he believed in something worth dying for." She nodded. "I do too," she whispered. He smiled. No cameras caught that smile. No headline quoted it. But I remember it, because it was the first time I'd seen Donald Trump look less like a figure and more like a man. Not the businessman, not the candidate, just a man. Then something happened. A boy, maybe 12, stepped out from the side. He wore a jacket a size too big and held something in his hand. A folded flag. He said nothing, just stood near them. His name was Caleb. His dad had died in Iraq. His mom was somewhere in the back. Caleb didn't try to get attention. He wasn't coached. He just showed up. Trump looked at him, then back at Reagan. "You're not alone," he said. That was it. And somehow that did more than any bill passed in Washington. He stood, helped Reagan to her feet, then turned to Caleb, who handed him the folded flag, not to keep, but to hold. Trump took it with both hands. He didn't raise it, didn't wave it. He just looked at it, like it was sacred. And in that room with all the lights and donors and reporters, the most powerful moment was two children who'd lost their fathers and a man who had finally said out loud that loss isn't weakness. It's weight. And for the first time, he chose to carry it not with policy, but with presence. Then, without a word, he handed the flag back to Caleb, placed a hand on his shoulder, and whispered something none of us heard. But we didn't need to, because we felt it. The moment was no longer about belief, it was about belonging. And everyone in that room, regardless of party or platform, belonged to that silence. Together, back behind the risers, under a rigged-up light and a tangle of wires, sat a man no one noticed. He wore a press badge, wire-rimmed glasses, a notebook stained with coffee. His name was Daniel Klein, a columnist for a national paper, known for being sharp skeptical, especially of Trump. He didn't shout, didn't argue, he just wrote. But tonight his pen wasn't moving. He hadn't scribbled a single line since Reagan stood up. And now, as Trump stepped back from the children, as silence wrapped itself around the room like a blanket, nobody expected Daniel stood. Not rushed, not grandstanding, he just stood. People near him turned. He wasn't supposed to speak. But he cleared his throat, and in the stillness the sound carried farther than anyone thought possible. "I came here to report," he said, voice low but firm, to cover the usual sound bites, Dodge's drama. He paused. "I've been doing this job for 30 years, covered 6 presidents, and I've never believed Donald Trump meant a word he said." The room froze. You could hear hearts start pounding. "I wrote columns mocking his faith. I called his appeals to God performative. And I meant every word. He stepped forward. I still have doubts, still have disagreements. But tonight, his voice cracked just slightly. Not enough to weaken him, just enough to remind you he was human. Tonight, I didn't see a politician. He looked directly at Trump. I saw a man who hurt, who remembered his brother not because it looked good on camera, but because it still lives in his chest. Someone in the crowd shifted. No applause yet, just eyes. Watching. Daniel continued. I don't know what your staff wrote for tonight, but I'm betting this wasn't it. Trump didn't speak, didn't nod, didn't blink. Just let him go on. I'm still not voting for you, Daniel said. The room chuckled lightly. But I need you to hear something, because I need me to hear it too. He took a breath. For the first time in a long time, I believed you. Gasps. Not of shock of recognition. Because when your fiercest critic says that it means the mask fell. Not just for the speaker, but for everyone listening. Daniel looked at Reagan, then to Caleb. You two don't need politics, he said. You need truth. And tonight, in a world built to sell you noise, you got truth. He stepped back, didn't drop the mic, didn't smile, just returned to his seat, sat down, looked at his notebook still blank. But this time he started to write. Not to report, to remember. And the crowd, they didn't cheer, they didn't rise. They absorbed. Because if a man like Daniel Klein hardened, published doubting could lower his guard for 5 minutes, what excuse did anyone else have? Trump hadn't moved. He didn't claim victory, didn't capitalize. He just stood there, hands folded, eyes lowered. Not in shame, in reverence. Because sometimes even the most powerful man in the room has to stay quiet when grace walks in uninvited. And for that one perfect stretch of time, no one cared about polls. No one cared about ratings. No one cared about sound bites. They cared about truth. Raw, unscripted, unavoidable. And for once it came from someone no one expected. The crowd was still reeling from Daniel's words. You could feel the weight shift from doubt to understanding to something deeper. Not belief, not yet. But maybe willingness. Trump remained by the stage steps. No more questions, no more answers. Just stillness. Reagan had sat back down, her mother holding her hand. But her eyes hadn't left Trump. And then without a word, she stood up again. Her movements were slow, not dramatic. Just sure. She reached into a small canvas bag slung across her shoulder, pulled something out, wrapped in cloth. She held it with both hands like it might break. And then she walked, straight down the center aisle. The crowd parted. No one spoke, no one needed to. Trump saw her coming. Didn't move, didn't speak. Just watched. She stopped in front of him, unwrapped the cloth. It was a medal, a bronze star, her father's. She looked up at Trump, this towering, controversial, larger-than-life figure, and said the smallest sentence of the night. My dad wanted me to give this to someone who wouldn't flinch when asked about faith. Her voice was steady. No tears, no fear, just conviction. Trump blinked, once, twice, then knelt slightly, enough to meet her eyes. Are you sure, he asked, voice barely audible? She nodded. He said I'd know who, and tonight I did. The room held its breath. She reached up and clipped the medal onto his jacket pocket. Not ceremonially, not like an award. Like a reminder. Trump didn't thank her, didn't make a speech. He just touched the medal once and placed his hand over his heart. A veteran in the third row began to stand. Then another, and another. No one said all rise. They just did. Like something sacred had entered the room, and they knew it. A woman whispered, "This isn't about politics anymore." A man nodded, eyes wet. It never was. Then Caleb, still holding the flag from earlier, walked forward again. This time no one stopped him. He stood beside Reagan, looked at Trump, and saluted. Not a child's mimic, a real salute. Firm, deliberate, meant. Trump returned it. Slow, full, and in that exchange there was no candidate, no press, no performance. Just 3 Americans connected not by platform, but by pain and promise. Then Reagan stepped back, turned, walked to her mother. Trump looked down at the medal, touched it once more, then spoke not to the crowd, but almost to himself. I've gotten a lot of honors. This is the only one that matters. No one cheered. They couldn't. They were too busy holding their breath, trying not to cry in public. Because in a world where faith is marketed, where loss is spun, where truth is buried beneath opinion, this was real, and everyone there felt it. The night didn't end with a roar. It ended with a whisper. No music played. No one rushed the stage. There were no autographs, no selfies. Just people, sitting, quietly, like they knew if they moved too quickly, they might break something invisible. Trump stepped back onto the stage, not to speak again, just to stand. The medal still clipped to his jacket, slightly crooked, still warm from the girl's hand. He didn't adjust it. Maybe because it wasn't supposed to look perfect. Maybe because it wasn't a symbol of perfection, but of pain, of memory, of meaning. Someone once said faith is what you hold when there's nothing left to carry. Tonight, Trump didn't carry a flag. He didn't carry a slogan. He carried a weight, and he didn't try to drop it. That was the difference. For all the years he'd been told he was loud, brash, and sensitive tonight, he was none of those things. He was present. And presence is rare. It's easy to show up for a crowd. Harder to show up for two kids holding the last thing their fathers gave them. Especially when those gifts aren't meant to flatter you, but to remind you of what you're not. A soldier, a martyr, a saint. And yet, he wore that medal like it belonged to every man who never came home. Every woman who folded laundry while waiting for a knock that never came. Every child who never got to say goodbye. People didn't talk as they left. They nodded. They looked at the floor. They held the arms of strangers. Because that's what happens when something real touches something broken. You don't speak, you remember. Backstage, Trump didn't ask for coverage, didn't call for a photographer. He sat alone for a few minutes, looking at the cloth the medal had been wrapped in. It had a tiny ink stain in the corner. The kind you'd miss unless you were trying to remember everything. And maybe he was. Maybe for once he didn't want to forget. Not because it helped him politically, not because it looked good, but because tonight, something changed. Not in policy, in posture. You could feel it in the way he breathed. Slower, heavier. Like a man who just realized he's not the story, just the one lucky enough to carry it for a little while. Later that night, someone on his team asked if he wanted to make a statement. He said no, then paused, then added, "They said more than I ever could." And he was right. Because Reagan's quiet, Caleb's salute, Daniel's confession, they said it all. That the real battles aren't on stage. That the real honors aren't framed. That the real questions, the ones that matter, don't come with time limits. They come from children, from grief, from God. And when they do, you answer not with words, but with stillness. By the time the chairs were stacked and the last person had filed out into the cold Iowa night, there was only one thing left on the stage. The microphone. Still. Idle. Untouched since the moment he stepped away. That more than anything told the story. Because tonight wasn't about what was said. It was about what was felt. Faith had walked into the room, not as a doctrine, but as a little girl with a red scarf and a bronze star in her pocket. And when she walked out, she left something behind. Not the medal, not the story. She left a question. The kind that doesn't fit on bumper stickers. The kind that stays with you when you brush your teeth or wait at red lights or lay awake at 2:17 a.m. wondering what you've really done with your life. It was the question Trump hadn't asked aloud, but had spoken with his stillness. What kind of country do we become when the only people who talk about God are the ones who've lost the most? That question doesn't have a speech. It doesn't have a slogan. It has a weight. And that weight, if we're honest, belongs to all of us. To the ones who've stopped believing, to the ones who fake it on Sundays, to the ones who pray only when the sirens get close. We carry that doubt in our briefcases, in our laughter, in our scrolling thumbs and cynical smirks. But tonight, we saw something else. We saw that doubt doesn't need to be defeated. It needs to be invited. Into the room, into the conversation, into the silence. Because it's in that silence that something holy stirs. Not religion, not performance, presence. Presence like Trump kneeling. Presence like Caleb standing. Presence like Daniel confessing. That's what makes us better. Not speeches. Moments. The kind that aren't retweeted. The kind that aren't clipped into viral sound bites. the kind that live in your spine, long after you've forgotten who was even on stage. One staffer said afterward, "We didn't win anything tonight." Maybe they're right, because some nights aren't for winning. They're for remembering. Remembering what it means to listen instead of lecture, to receive instead of respond, to hold space instead of hold power. There's a kind of patriotism that doesn't wear red, white, and blue. It wears grief. It wears humility. It wears a bronze star placed on your lapel by a child whose father believed in something bigger than all of us. And if that doesn't change you, nothing will. By the time the lights dimmed and the stage cleared, the moment was over. But its echo stayed. Not in headlines, not in transcripts. In people. In the ones who drove home slower than usual. In the ones who didn't turn on the radio. In the ones who reached for their phones and then didn't dial anyone. Something had shifted. Not because Donald Trump gave a perfect answer, but because he didn't pretend to have one. He let the question sit. And in that space where a little girl dared to ask, where a man dared to answer, and where a room dared to feel, a new kind of conversation began. Not about politics, about presence, not about who's right, about who's real. So here's the thing. You don't have to agree with him. You don't have to like him. You don't even have to vote for him. But ask yourself, when was the last time someone looked you in the eyes and didn't flinch when you brought up faith or pain or someone you've lost? When was the last time a public figure didn't rush past the hard part, didn't talk over your grief, didn't turn it into a pitch? That's what happened tonight. One man stayed still. 2 kids stepped forward. And a nation leaned in. Maybe we don't need more answers. Maybe we need more people willing to stand there quietly when a child asks, "Do you believe in God?" So no, this isn't a call to donate, or to campaign, or to argue. It's a call to remember Fred, to remember Reagan's dad, to remember the spaces between applause lines where humanity lives. And maybe tomorrow when you see someone hurting, you'll think of tonight. And instead of talking, you'll listen, because that might be the most powerful thing we can do right now. Listen, stay still, and believe just enough to stay present.